Shortly before the opening of his library, President Nixon said, "Libraries can be passive, dry repositories of books and documents." I hope that the Nixon Library and Birthplace will be different. A vital place of discovery and rediscovery, of investigation and contemplation, of study, debate, and analysis. The 2024 Presidential Policy Perspective Series was stood up to fulfill President Nixon's vision for his library. Invitations were issued to every major party declared candidate for the United States presidency to visit the Nixon Library and deliver remarks in this room in any format on any topic. Tonight, we welcome Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., an independent candidate for President of the United States. Mr. Kennedy is an environmental attorney. He has founded or served as counsel to several nonprofit environmental groups, including Riverkeeper. He is one of the best-known environmental attorneys in the United States, and he was named by Time magazine as a, quote, hero of the planet. He hails from Massachusetts. He hails from Massachusetts, graduated from Harvard University, attended the London School of Economics, and earned his JD from the University of Virginia School of Law and a Master of Laws from Pace University. He is the son of former United States Attorney General and New York Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and the nephew of our 35th President, John F. Kennedy. It's my pleasure to welcome him to the Nixon Library this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm very, very grateful for that introduction, Jim, and I'm really honored to have this opportunity to talk at the Nixon Library. My family, as all of you know, had a long, long relationship with President Nixon. I was telling Jim on the way down here that I have a collection of all the president's signatures that I've been collecting since I was a little boy, and I wrote President Nixon in the mid-'70s and asked him, I said his was the one signature I was missing, and he wrote me a very long and very gracious letter, and he sent me a lot of his business cards, enough to distribute his signatures to all signed. It was very, very sweet of him. My family had an adversarial politically. My family was adversaries of President Nixon, but my uncle always held him in really deep affection, personal affection. And before they ran, because they had both been World War II veterans, they had that in common, and they respected each other for that. And President Nixon had many of them, although they were political adversaries at the time, they were like people of each generation. They were more like each other than anybody of the next generation. And they both had this extraordinary curiosity about history, a deep encyclopedic knowledge about history. They were both playing for history, which I think is a really important virtue for a president to have. And they both were brilliant writers. And President Nixon wrote his own speeches, as did my uncle. He wrote them longhand on yellow legal pads, and my uncle did the same thing. And they were people who could think for themselves. They were people who both stood up to their own bureaucracies. And they were people who had intense interest in foreign affairs and came into the White House with a very, very clear agenda of what they wanted to do and a knowledge about the uses of power. And that's a virtue that very few presidents have had since then. And so I'm honored to be here tonight. I wanted to say one thing to give a plug for this museum. One of the things that the Nixon Museum is sponsoring now is the American Civics campaign. And the American Civics campaign is to return the teaching of civics to school. When I was a little boy, we had 3 civics courses that everybody had to take when we were kids. And civics was abandoned sometime, I think, in the late 70s. And I never realized how important that was until COVID, when we saw this extraordinary assault on the Bill of Rights that was unprecedented in American history. And by January of 2020, at the beginning of COVID, the government began working with social media companies and media companies to censor speech by Americans. And it was the first time in the history that it happened systematically. I have a lawsuit now that is in front of the Supreme Court, Kennedy versus Biden. I worked very hard on the companion lawsuit that was brought by Louisiana and Missouri Attorney Generals, Murphy versus Biden, which addresses the censorship issues. And then we know from the discovery in those lawsuits, and by the way, can you hear me in the back there? I guess, yeah. We know from those lawsuits and from the Twitter files, a lot of what was happening, because we have the emails that were being sent by the White House to the social media companies and to the media companies as well. And we know the threats that were being made to end the Section 230 immunity of those companies, which is existential. So they were under threat that if you do not censor our political opponents or the speech that we need censored, that we're going to destroy you. And we saw at the beginning the censorship of speech with, in fact, 37 hours after he took the oath of office, President Biden swearing to uphold the Constitution. President Biden's White House was in furious exchange of emails with Facebook, with Twitter, with Instagram, with YouTube, with Google, telling them that they had to censor political speech. It began as COVID, a speech about COVID, but it quickly expanded. And we have internal memos from those companies complaining about it and saying this is very cynical, it's very corrupt, but we got to go along with it. And once they began censoring speech, they began people, not just people like me. My Instagram account with almost 1 million followers was removed. There was no misinformation on it. Instagram was never able to point to a single false statement that I made. All the things that I put on Instagram were cited and sourced to peer-reviewed publications, to government databases. And Facebook pushed back at one point and said, this is not misinformation, it's actually true. They had to come up with a new term called malinformation, which is information that is true, but it nevertheless is inconvenient for the government. And once they established this beachhead of censoring speech, they went after all of the other constitutional rights, and systematically and very, very quickly was a whole generation of Americans beginning in 1776 that sacrificed their lives, their freedoms, their property, their status, their salaries to give us the Bill of Rights. And in 1 year, we completely dismantled them. They went after the next thing is the other leg of the First Amendment, freedom of worship. They closed every church in our country with no scientific citation for a year. They then went after the right to assemble, which is also in the First Amendment. They implemented these social distancing mandates, which we now know and they now admit had no scientific basis. They then went after our property rights, the Fifth Amendment, right of due process and just compensation before the government takes your property. They closed down every business in our country, 3.3 million businesses with no due process, no just compensation, no public hearings, no notice and comment rulemaking, no environmental impact statements, all of the safeguards of democracy that allow the regulatory process to function within a democracy, and they were all dismantled. They went after the Fourth Amendment guarantees against warrantless searches and seizures with all this very complex track and trace surveillance where you had to give your medical records to the government before you did things, before you went to a building, before you got on an airplane. And they went after jury trials. The Seventh Amendment very simply says that no American shall be denied the right of a trial before a jury of his peers in case there are controversies exceeding $25. That's all it said. There's no pandemic exception. And they know, the framers knew all about epidemics. There were two epidemics during the Revolution. There was an epidemic of malaria that decimated the armies of Virginia. There was another epidemic of smallpox that decimated the Army of New England at the very time when Benedict Arnold, our greatest general, had conquered Montreal. We were in the inner city, and he had taken it, but he could not hold it because his men were all down with smallpox. But for that smallpox epidemic, Canada today would be part of the United States. And the framers all knew that when they gathered, in 1789, 1791, to include the Bill of Rights. And yet they did not include an epidemic exception in the Constitution. They wrote it for hard times. They didn't write it for easy times. The First Amendment is there not to protect convenient speech or speech that the government likes. It's there to protect the speech that nobody wants to hear. The speech, and during the Civil War, the Confederacy was sending agents, provocateurs up into the northern states to drum up draft riots. And it was absolutely devastating, demoralizing a northern cause. And President Lincoln knew who these guys were. And they began arresting them and suspending habeas corpus because they hadn't done anything yet, but he knew what they were about to do. And this went up to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Taney said, you can't do that. It doesn't matter that the nation itself is at stake. 559,000 people, or 659,000 people, died in the Civil War. It's the equivalent of 7.2 million people today, much more than COVID. And yet the Supreme Court said, you can't do it. It doesn't matter how many people are going to die. It doesn't matter. The Constitution is more important than anything. They wrote it for hard times. And it's been the ambition of every totalitarian system throughout the history of mankind to control every aspect of human behavior. They've never been able to do it because they don't have the technology. But today, that technology now exists. We have facial recognition system that's watching us all the time. We have digital currency that allows the government now and increasingly to understand every purchase that you make. We have GPS that's following us, knows where we are all day in our cars, in our watches, in our devices. We have Alexa and we have, Siri, and are listening to everything you say, every conversation you have, and recording it with the NSA. Harvesting your data, these big corporations. Bill Gates has this now data center that is harvesting all this data and then monetizing it. Siri is not working for you. Alexa is not working for you. They're working for Bill Gates and the NSA. And when a government, so it's more important than ever that we have a deep commitment to our constitutional rights in this country, because the capacity of the government to enslave us is like nothing before. They have technology that can look through walls. You can't hide in your house anymore. You can't hide anywhere. There's approval now for 415,000 low-altitude satellites that will be able to look at every square inch of our Earth 24 hours a day. And this is the time we need to be raising the barrier of our constitutional rights and inculcating and imbuing the generation of Americans that nobody is allowed to touch these. And what I recognized during COVID when I was fighting these incursions, they gave us back a lot of these rights, but once the government sets the precedent that they're allowed to take them away, that right is much weaker than ever before. So now they can take them away if they're for any crisis, for war, for financial crisis, and they have an endless pipeline of new epidemics that they can use as justification. And our rights are going to mean nothing if the only way those rights are going to exist is just a piece of paper unless we all believe in them, unless we're all committed to them. And we need to start teaching civics to our kids because, we watch the entire American press go along with this and say, yeah, that's okay. We need to silence these people. They're supposed to be the guardians. They're supposed to be in a constant posture of fierce skepticism toward government policies and government pronouncements and other pronouncements by large agglomerations of power. And they did the opposite. They became stenographers for the government. They became propagandists for the government. They're supposed to speak truth to power. They were speaking for the powerful to the powerless. And they were stifling dissent, and they were involved in it. So, all these institutions of our democracy only function if the American people believe in them. And we're not educating kids about it anymore. And I went to Berlin in August of 2020 to speak. 1.3 million people from all over Europe came to Berlin to protest the mandates that were being, Western democracy was collapsing worldwide. And they all came together and, it was condemned later as a right-wing plot, but it looked like Woodstock there. It was people of every color, of every nationality, and just joyful people celebrating constitutional rights of Western democracy that were even then being robbed from. Now, I was speaking at that event, and I wasn't wearing a mask, and an NBC film crew came up to me and said, why aren't you wearing a mask? Aren't you scared of dying? And I said, there's a lot more scary things than death. And they said, like what? I said, like losing my constitutional rights and having... Like I said, there was a generation of Americans who, thank God, felt that same way and died, many of them, to give us these rights. And we need to teach our kids that lesson, and we need to imbue them with that value and that understanding that this is a thing they need to safeguard more than anything. So the next time the government tries to take our constitutional rights, that our kids will rise up and fight them till hell freezes over, and then fight them on the ice. Because and if we don't do that, we are going to lose this country, and this country will be meaningless. Because, what is this country mean? It's beautiful landscapes. It's people from all over the world. But the thing that makes us Americans is our Constitution. And if we give that away as easily as we did during COVID, there's going to be nothing left of value in this country. So I want to thank the Nixon Library for launching this project. They're raising $40 million. They've already raised half of that, $20 million. Many generous people in this room have given. And I encourage all of those of you who are here today, all of you who hear this broadcast, to give whatever you can, because it seems to be the only institution in this country that understands that. My uncle and President Nixon were very different, but both of them would have given their lives to make sure that we keep our constitutional rights in this country. They both went to World War II for that. August 9th will mark the 15th anniversary of President Nixon's resignation from office. And although Watergate overshadowed his presidential achievements in the public mind to a large extent, there's at least one thing which we remember him for, and rightly so, in a very, very positive light, President Nixon's visit to China in February of 1972 was a major milestone in the history of the Cold War. A cynic might say that it was a strategic maneuver to drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union, and perhaps to some extent it was, but it was much, much more than that. So tonight, I'd like to say a bit more about this watershed moment of the Cold War and what it might teach us today. It's a relevant topic because today we're again facing rising tensions between the world's most powerful powers, Russia, the Soviet Union, Russia, China, and the United States. The threat of nuclear war is greater than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Maybe there's something important today that we can learn from President Nixon's approach 50 years ago. Besides opening unofficial diplomatic relationships with China, we also remember Richard Nixon with admiration for initiating detente with the Soviet Union. As you all know, President Nixon was no shrinking violet when it came to communism. He was a hardline red baiter. He built his career on anti-communist crusades. Yet it was he who negotiated the anti-ballistic missile treaty with the Soviet Union. It was he who pulled the United States out of Vietnam. And it was he who opened up relations with China. President Nixon embraced the approach that his Secretary of State called realpolitik, which, of course, Henry Kissinger, which in its normal sense means the pragmatic advancement of national interests based upon real conditions and not ideology. Realpolitik recognizes that leaders and their nations must be seen as they really are rather than as we wish they would be. In President Nixon's time, the United States official position was that the CCP was an illegitimate regime and that the true government of China was the Kuomintang, which had fled to Taiwan in 1949 and still claimed to rule the whole of China. For 2 decades, we maintained a pretense that the communist government would soon collapse and that Chiang Kai-shek would sweep back into power and China would rejoin the free world. Nixon's visit to China was the beginning of coming to terms with reality. He was moving to opt out of the fantasy. Today, US foreign policy is based on a delusion far more egregious and far more dangerous than the daydream that Chiang Kai-shek was the true president of China. We seem to think that we're still where we were in the same world as in 1991, the world's only superpower, a peerless hegemon that brooks no rival and can bend any nation to its will. We are stuck in that past. A nation, or for that matter, any individual that can maintain an illusion like that only at an ever-increasing cost, obsessed with the idea of our nation's strength. We ignore the growing infirmity at our core. The foundation of a nation's strength is the soundness of its infrastructure, the physical vitality of its people, the integrity of its government, the respect it enjoys abroad, and its economic strength. In each of these, for 40 or 50 years, the United States outclassed all the other nations in the world. But power breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds neglect, and neglect ultimately breeds weakness. In his classic book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, the iconic Yale historian Paul Kennedy, no relation, has shown how virtually all the great empires of the last 500 years have collapsed from the weight of overextended military commitments abroad. The same pitfall is now undermining the American experiment with self-government. As we poured our wealth into one military operation after another in the pursuit of global empire, our nation began to decay from within. 30 years and tens of trillions of dollars later, we stagger under a decaying infrastructure, an epidemic of chronic disease, a plague of addiction, and historic economic inequality. America has lost its moral authority and a great portion of its stature abroad. These are casualties of decades of unjust wars, regime change operations, support for dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, and suppression of popular democratic movements. As above, so below. So as abroad, so at home. What America did to the world, it did to itself. As America pursued imperial power in the guise of promoting democracy, so too democracy has become a mere facade at home. The dramatic decline of America's middle class has yielded a new oligarchy of billionaires above and widespread poverty below. This is a configuration too unstable to sustainably support democracy in any nation. Yes, we still have elections, but so does Iran, so does Russia, so does China. Meanwhile, our government targets its own people with propaganda, surveillance, and censorship. It centralizes power in the hands of a corporate and political elite. It deploys government agencies like the DOJ, the EPA, the FCC, the IRS, and even the Secret Service to persecute and disadvantage its political enemies. Most significantly, we've lost faith in ourselves as a good people and a great nation. The authentic patriotism of the post-World War II era gave way to the Bush-Cheney jingoism. America's can-do spirit has succumbed to a national epidemic of depression, addiction, and chronic disease. How are people to believe in this nation when government has neglected them and neglected the high ideals of its founders? In 2013, there was a national poll done of Americans under 35 years of age. And they were asked one question: are you proud of the United States of America? 85% said yes. The same poll taken 5 months ago, only 18% said yes. So we have a whole generation of Americans that has lost hope in their own future and lost their pride in our country. The American dream is now a bitter illusion. The promise that hard work and integrity will lift you out of poverty is broken. The America my youth boasted the largest middle class in the world. It was the greatest economic engine ever devised by humanity. And we had the highest degree of social mobility. It was easiest in our nation of any other nation to rise out of poverty and to go into the upper class. Today, we are the most stratified and immobile country in the Western world. Poor Americans are less likely than the poor of any Western nation to transcend their poverty. All of this has been the price of the delusion of which I have spoken. This is what happens when a nation's policies are stuck in a world that no longer exists. But the good news is that we can reverse all of these conditions, all of the indicia of our decline. The first step is to stop pretending that we can and should dominate the world by force. Instead, we need to now start to acknowledge reality, accept reality, and forge a national program that takes reality into account. Like it or not, the unipolar moment is over. It's time, way past time, for the United States to accept a multipolar world order. Just as President Nixon accepted the reality of CCP rule in China, we have to accept the emergence of other great powers in the world. And let me tell you, this does not entail the diminishment of our nation's fortune or our isolation from world affairs. Instead, it promises the restoration of our prosperity, our health, our re-engagement with the world as a moral and economic leader, rather than a bully, and our belief in ourselves, the people. Let me offer a few practical examples of what it means to accept multipolarity and how we're going to benefit from that as a nation. First, it means that we can vastly scale back our military budget. You see, most of that budget has no role in defending the American homeland. It's all about projecting power abroad. It's all about maintaining dominance. It's no longer necessary if we accept that we do not need to dominate the world. Imagine what we could have done with the $8 trillion that we spent on regime change wars post 9/11. We could have made Social Security solvent for another generation. We could have remedied the $2.3 trillion infrastructure deficit. We could have ended poverty. We could have balanced the US budget. Well, that was money ill spent. Not only did it bankrupt our country, hollow out the middle class, and leave us the legacy of demoralizing and soul-crushing inflation, we didn't even achieve the stated goals of bringing peace and democracy to the nations we targeted. Quite the contrary. Every one of those nations ended up less democratic and worse off than we found them. Just take Iraq, where we spent $3.6 trillion to bring democracy. What happened in Iraq? We killed more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein. We left an incoherent nation that is just a battle between Shia and Sunni despots. We pushed Iraq into a proxy posture with Iran, exactly the foreign policy outcome that we spent $1 trillion trying to avoid in the previous 10 years. We created ISIS. We drove 4 million immigrants up into Europe and destabilized all the Western democracies of Europe for generations. Brexit is a direct result, a straight line from our war in Iraq and the spillover war in Syria. You can tell the same story about all the places where we had military intervention, the same cataclysmic, apocalyptical results in every one of them. We can't go back in time and retrieve that money, but we can chart a new course starting now. Today, we spend something like $1.3 trillion on national security. If you include the intelligence agencies, the Department of Energy, and so on. My commitment is to roll back that spending to the Eisenhower minimum that existed when President Nixon, Vice President Nixon was vice president and Eisenhower was president. That was the level it was in 1960 in constant dollars. If that was enough at the height of the Cold War, it should be enough today. In other words, I will push for a 50% reduction in military expenditures in my first 4 years in office, with more cuts to come thereafter. In the end, we're going to have a stronger, smarter, better targeted national defense. And I will use those savings to rebuild our country in every way there is. Military spending is a constant drain on our nation's vitality. China spends 1/3 what we spend on the military. We have 800 bases abroad. The Chinese have 1.5. The Russians have 1. And during the period when we spend $8 trillion bombing bridges, roads, airports, schools, and hospitals in our failed war on terror, the Chinese were spending the exact same amount building roads, schools, hospitals, airports. They were projecting economic power abroad rather than military power. Our wars, our forever wars, made us enemies across the globe, left us bankrupt at home. China's investments, in contrast, made it friends across the globe and brought it influence in every corner of the earth. China is now the biggest creditor in most of the nations of Latin America and in Africa. When his best friend, Ben Bradley, asked my uncle, President Kennedy, what he wanted on his gravestone, he said he kept the peace. That's what he wanted as his epithet. When 3 days before he took office, I was in Washington, D.C. at that time. I was a 6-year-old boy, and I went to his inauguration. And President Eisenhower, on my birthday, January 17th, 1961, gave a speech that we should look back on now as one of the most important speeches in American history, where he warned America against the emergence of a military-industrial complex that would change the structure of our country and rob us of the beloved institutions of our democracy. My uncle understood that, and he spent his 3 years in office battling the military-industrial complex. He refused to send, he said he didn't want that the primary job of a president of the United States was to keep the country out of war. He said he didn't want children in Africa and Latin America, when they heard United States of America, to think of a man in a military uniform with a gun. He wanted them to think of a Peace Corps volunteer. He wanted them to think of the Alliance for Progress and USAID, which he created to put America on the side of the poor, to help build middle classes in these countries and make friends in these countries. And during his time in office, he refused the pressure from his intelligence apparatus and his military brass to go into Laos in '61, to go into Cuba in '61, to go into Germany during the Checkpoint Charlie crisis in '62, to go into Cuba again during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he refused to send combat troops to Vietnam, despite pressure from all of his most trusted advisors who said, you got to send 250,000 troops or the government's going to collapse. And he said, it's their war. He ended up sending 16,000 advisors who technically were not allowed to participate in combat, but they did anyway. They were Green Berets and helicopter instructors and pilots. And then he sent 16,000 people, by the way, which is troops, advisors, which are fewer troops than he sent to integrate Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, for one black man, James Meredith. And then in October 22nd, 1963, he learned that a Green Beret had died in Vietnam. And he asked his aide, Walt Rostow, to give him a full complement of military casualties in Vietnam. And Walt Rostow came back and 75 Americans had died, which shocked him. And he said, that's too many. That afternoon, he signed National Security Order 263, ordering all military personnel home from Vietnam by 1965, with the first 1,000 coming home in December of '63, which would have been 6 weeks later. 30 days to the day after he signed that order, he was assassinated. And a week after that, President Johnson remanded that order and ended up sending 250,000 troops. And then we went 500,000, and 56,000 of them never returned, including my cousin, George Skakel, who died in the Tet Offensive. And that was the call. My uncle understood that what we need to do to make us powerful as a nation is to be engaged in the world, but by projecting economic power abroad rather than military power. And because of that, because of his commitment to that, there are now more statues to John Kennedy, more boulevards and avenues and streets named after him, more universities and hospitals and colleges and schools named, and parks named after John F. Kennedy than any other president of the United States, and probably more than all the presidents combined. And that is a important national security achievement. That makes us all safe around the world. That makes us all influential around the world. In addition to that money that China spent on its Belt and Road program, China has also spent nearly that amount, about $8 trillion, building up its economic infrastructure. For example, it built 26,000 miles of high-speed rail during that same period. Anyone who's flown on a commercial airline in this country recently understands how important that would be. Let me give you another example of the advantages of embracing the transition to multipolarity. It has to do with the US dollar. Starting in the 1970s, American power has depended increasingly on the status of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. How have we been able to rack up huge budget deficits year after year with huge trade deficits without weakening our currency? Normally, a country that does that will experience inflation as the cost of imports rises to bring trade back into balance. That didn't happen in our country until recently. Why? because there was a demand for the US dollars far beyond what other countries needed to buy US goods. The dollar was the global trading currency. The dollar was the global reserve currency. The dollar was the global safe haven. So all of those dollars that we printed didn't result in inflation. It was an illusion. They stayed in the foreign reserves of countries like Japan and China, which invested them in US Treasury bonds. Basically, all these other countries have been financing our deficits. No other country could print unlimited quantities of money, which is the only way we go to war, by the way. You know, fiat currency was invented to finance wars and also other insane projects. And it makes you irrational to print it. And that's what happened. The wars wouldn't have happened if the politicians had to come to us and say, we want to spend $3.6 trillion to get rid of Saddam Hussein, who had nothing to bomb the world, nothing to do with bombing the World Trade Center. And it's going to mean that you're going to live in relative poverty if we do that. You're going to have to pay for it. Nobody would do it. But they don't have to do that. They can just go to war without even getting Congress to approve, and then they just print the money afterward. And that is a tax. Inflation is a tax on the poor. It's a tax on the middle class, and that's how we gutted the middle class. Nobody could do this, to print money without consequence, but we could. We could, that is, until recently. That privilege depended on the special status of the dollar, the cornerstone of America's dominance. But today, that status is crumbling. No longer can we rely on the imperial dollar to compensate for the loss of our industrial base. No longer can we rely on it to fund our deficits. Realpolitik requires that we face up to that fact, that new reality. The more we try to hold on to the past, the more we hasten the day of reckoning, the apocalyptical day of reckoning. Already, by weaponizing the dollar, we've accelerated its decline. Russia has become nearly immune to our sanctions. China is rapidly establishing the yuan as an international trade currency. The BRICS just last week launched their mBridge settlements platform that uses blockchain technology to bypass SWIFT. 2 days ago, the Saudis announced their decision not to renew their 50-year petrodollar deal with the United States. Another step on the long road toward de-dollarization. Now, I don't want to overstate the case. The dollar still remains the world's dominant currency. If we want to keep it that way, we have to stop using it as a bludgeon. The way to keep the dollar strong is to keep the country strong. We can do that by redirecting our bloated military budget toward infrastructure, education, and health, and building our economy and building small business, which is the greatest economic engine in history, American middle class and American small business, and in innovation. We can do it by reestablishing the integrity of our financial markets. We can do it by de-weaponizing the dollar so that other nations feel secure in keeping their wealth in our dollars. We can do that by spending responsibly and by reducing our deficits. We won't be the imperial hegemon anymore. We won't be able to import more than we export. We will instead be the first among equals, and that is a good thing. As long as America was the unchallenged global superpower, it could do whatever it wanted. We're like a teenage bully in a playground of third graders. We could make the rules for everyone else. But now the third graders have grown up. Our bravado, our bluster no longer frighten them. When we threaten to take away their toys, and that's called sanctions, they just laugh at us. Our toy, the US dollar, is still the best one on the playground. But it won't be for long unless we start playing as equals. The world today faces challenges far greater than the threat one nation poses to another. Our nation, all the nations of the world have to start working together to address multiple catastrophic and existential risks. I'm speaking here of bioweapons proliferation. I'm speaking of nuclear proliferation. I'm speaking of AI weapons. I'm speaking of ecological tipping points. Some of these threats are familiar for a long time to us. Some of them are new. The prospect of nuclear war today is nearer than any time since 1962, largely because America has clung so desperately to its imperial fantasies. But maybe even more frightening is the rapid advance in bioweapons technology. The technological hurdles to creating bioweapons and superviruses are getting lower and lower. We need urgently to create international cooperation to halt this new and potentially apocalyptic arms race. And many of you probably know that President Nixon in 1973, I think it was, went to Fort Detrick, which was at that time, we had been developing bioweapons since 1947. The CIA and the Pentagon and the Navy mainly, we had brought in all these Operation Paperclip scientists from Germany and from Japan, from World War II, and we put them in Fort Detrick and some of these other centers, and we were very aggressively developing bioweapons. And we had, at that point, the bioweapons cartel boasted that we had reached nuclear equivalency, that we could kill people cheaper than a nuclear weapon with bioweapons. It was estimated at that time that we could kill the entire population of Russia or the United States for about 29 cents a life using bioweapons. Nixon surprised the world. He went to Fort Detrick and he announced that we were unilaterally shutting down our bioweapons program, and that he would then go to the rest of the world and ask them to do the same. But he did it here first without asking anybody whether they would go along with it. He then went out with this extraordinary diplomatic capacity that he had, and he got all the other nations in the world, almost all of them, to sign the Bioweapons Charter, to agree to stop any kind of creation or experimentation with bioweapons. And then after the anthrax attacks in 2001, we passed the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act had a hidden, it was 342-page bill that nobody had read. It was passed because, the anthrax attacks had shut down Congress. The anthrax was later found to have come from Fort Detrick. It was originally blamed on Saddam Hussein. It was one of the justifications for us going into the Iraq War. But the FBI later determined that it had come from a US lab, that it was US developed bioweapons material. It shut down Congress, and during that shutdown, they passed the Patriot Act. The two men who were blocking the Patriot Act, Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy, were the ones who were targeted for anthrax. And with their opposition disappeared, the Patriot Act ran through Congress. The Patriot Act had a provision on it that nobody had read that gave any federal official who violated the Geneva Convention, violated Nixon's bioweapon charter, immunity from liability. So it relaunched a bioweapons arms race, which is now all over the globe. And when that bioweapons research is married with AI, it is very, very dangerous. And we need global cooperation to do what Nixon did, which is stand it again. A cooperation on issues like this is cooperations on issues like this will never happen if we continue to see every rival as our enemy. To be realistic about the state of the world, to accept multipolar order, will benefit our country. We cannot go on pretending. We can't go on pretending that that we're running the globe. For all the bloviating about American interests, America has been in steady decline for the past 60 years of its imperial project. In other words, the American interests have not been in America's interests. Sure, our policies have enriched mega corporations and a billionaire class, as President Eisenhower predicted, but most of the country is suffering. It's time now to rethink what our national interests really are. Just as our authentic national interests suffered in the imperial age, so it will improve in the post-imperial age. It will improve when we invest in peace. It will improve when we turn our attention home again. And paradoxically, by releasing the ambition to dominate, we will once again rise to a position of primacy in the world. Why? It is because America has certain advantages that we can now reclaim. You see, the true foundation of America's greatness is not just our natural resources or a large population. It's our national character, our free markets, and our Constitution. These are assets that will allow us to excel in the multipolar age. In a country like China, the success of an enterprise depends not on making great products or running an efficient business, but on political influence. That might allow it to dominate Chinese markets, but it becomes weak abroad, requiring constant government assistance. But in a free economy, only the most efficient and innovative companies can survive. Unfortunately, our country has become more and more like China as corporations have captured Congress and the regulatory agencies. They've written the regulations to favor themselves and to punish the innovation class, the small businesses, to put them at disadvantage. They lobby Congress and garner a competitive edge and vast subsidies. The engines of innovation, the small and medium enterprises, cannot compete with that. Our mega corporations have wedded themselves so closely to political power that they are tantamount to the state-owned enterprises in China. Same for our freedoms. The America I grew up in did not censor speech. It did not restrict freedom of movement. It respected freedom of association. The free flow of people and ideas is the lifeblood not only of democracy, but also of our economic vitality. As president, I'm going to restore those freedoms and thereby restore to America its competitive advantage in the world. We saw with the fall of the Soviet Union, a country that in its heyday exceeded the US in both population, land, and resources. We saw the inferiority of a command and control system. That's why I'm confident that we can outcompete any country in the world by returning to our traditions of being the freest country in the world. We didn't beat the USSR on the battlefield, and we don't have to subdue our rivals today through military might either. We don't have to intimidate them into submission. As President Nixon understood, America will do fine in a multipolar world. I foresee a day when our trade deficits once again become trade surpluses as they were up until the Vietnam War. I foresee a day when we once again will lead the world by example and not by force. I foresee a day when America stands for peace and not for war. To abandon the dreams of empire is not to resign ourselves to second-class status in the world. Quite the opposite, it's to fulfill our true potential for greatness and the ideals of our founders. Again, the first step toward this is truth. It is the realpolitik that recognizes the inevitability of the end of the American empire. Then we can adjust purposefully and gracefully and very quickly to a new order in global affairs. We can stand for freedom, not just in our own country, but also in the world. We can defy the totalitarian tendencies in global governance. We can demonstrate the superiority of a truly free society. That's the destiny of America, not to dominate the world, but to inspire it. President Nixon understood this. He knew we didn't have to beat China and that it was not good for the world to beat China in a military contest. He was confident that we could beat them in an economic contest. My uncle was not scared of competing with any other society in the world. He understood that by projecting economic power, we were competing on a different battlefield, but it was the battlefield of economic vitality. And both President Nixon and my uncle understood that that was going to be a big benefit for China. It was going to be a big benefit for all of the other nations of the world that do not want to see a war or a conflict between us and Russia and us and China. and that most of all, it would be a big benefit for our country. We have to have confidence in who we are as a people. This is a noble experiment that we're all involved in. And it's an experiment in self-governance, which means freedom. And we're supposed to be modeling these virtues for everybody else in the world. We have to have confidence that by modeling those virtues, they're going to work for us, and they're going to create the kind of country, the template for freedom that is not only going to enrich the world, but also going to inspire it. And that's our role in history, and that's the role that I will pursue as President of the United States. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Now, I think I'm going to take a few questions.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, you are. We are very, very tight on time, so we only have the opportunity for a couple of questions. Our first question, back of the room to your left, sir.
Oh, all right, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. And given that our country has suffered an influx of over 10 million trespassers coming in, we have elections coming up in the national, state, and local areas. What do you feel about voter ID?
I'll tell you what I'm going to do on day one when I get into office is I'm going to order the State Department and the Post Office to issue passport cards to every American who says they can't afford them. Right now, there are tens of millions of Americans who don't have any government-issued photo ID, and they're mainly constituents of the Democratic Party. Oh, there are elderly people whose driver's licenses have expired. There are students who don't yet have a license, and there are minorities in our cities, people who don't need to drive. As you know, it's expensive to get a license if you're poor. It also is, I don't know what it's like in California, but it is one of the worst nightmares in New York to go to DMV for the day that anybody can imagine. So nobody's going to do that. But there are 33,000 post offices in this country, and they're within walking distance of most homes. In Texas, there's some counties where you have to drive for over 100 miles to get to a DMV. People aren't going to do it. But everybody can get to a post office. And people don't do it because there's a barrier, the expense, which costs from $65 to $100, and that's a lot for people. If you don't have, it's going to solve three problems. One is if you don't have ID in this country, you're a second-class citizen. You can't open a bank account. You can't go to a hotel. You can't get on an airplane. You can't visit your children at school. Oh, poverty begets more hardship, more poverty, and it will solve that problem. Number two, it will, I spent several days at the border. I watched between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. in Yuma, I watched 300 people walk across the border. And the Border Patrol was ferrying them to the airport and putting them on planes to any place they want in our country. It's the most insane thing I've ever seen a government do ever. And I interviewed a lot of the people, I interviewed half the people I saw coming over that night, and every one of them, with two exceptions, told me they were here for a job. Well, in New York, it's illegal in this country for an employer to employ an undocumented alien. But there's a catch. The only thing that they have to show is that they saw a Social Security card. And in New York, in construction sites, Social Security cards are passed from person to person. There's no photo on them. They're easily fabricated. They're passed hand to hand, and then the employer pays in cash. All they have to do is check a box saying, I saw the Social Security card. I'm going to change that rule to say you can't get a job unless you show a government-issued photo ID. This isn't realistic in a country where 20 million or more people don't have them. oh, I'm going to fix that, and I'm going to fix the border in other ways, and secure it so nobody's coming across. But this was this is another safeguard, because if the whole world knows you cannot get a job in the United States of America unless you have a government-issued photo ID, people are just not going to come. Many of those people. I've consulted with civil rights leaders, with, the Democrats don't like photo ID because they say that's going to disenfranchise tens of millions of our constituents. So they don't want that. It's logical. I've consulted, our team has consulted with Andrew Young, with Reverend Al Sharpton, and with other top civil rights leaders who have all agreed that if I issue this order and those IDs become available to every American, they will withdraw their objections to IDs in the voting booth. And that will reduce this terrible tension, because the Democratic and Republican Party will both support IDs at voting booths, which of course we need. We need Americans to believe in the system. By the way, that's the kind of solution that will never come from the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. It's a solution that has to come from somebody else, because it's not a Republican or Democratic issue, and it's actually a realistic, common sense solution. And for that reason, they want to fight about these things. What we're trying to do is devise solutions that work for all Americans, that are common sense, and that we can sell to both political parties, because they won't be branded. They're coming from an independent. And so they won't be branded a Republican solution or Democratic solution, and it will allow everybody to support it.
All right, we have time for one last question. A number of you submitted questions on cards on the way in, and so we'll take this one from there. If elected president, I wonder if you might share who candidates for your cabinet might be. Specifically, who would you have as Secretary of State?
You know what? I don't think I'm going to answer that question, because I don't want to embarrass anybody, and I don't want to embarrass myself if they said no tomorrow. So let's do another question, and if you guys can let me off the hook on that one.
All right, let's do another one here. Let me. If I could read your handwriting, we'd be in good. What is the primary issue that you would focus on as president?
Well, I'll tell you, I'll just give you a quick retina of the issues. The biggest issue, or one of the biggest issues facing us, is the debt. It's now $34 trillion. The interest on that debt is now 8% of GDP. We are borrowing money. The interest this year is 1.3 trillion. So we're spending 1.3 trillion, which is more than our military budget, just on the interest of the debt. And that is 8% of GDP. Historically, it's been 2%. The two people who ran up that debt were President Biden and President Trump. President Trump would promise to balance the budget, instead spent $8 trillion, which is more than all presidents in the United States history combined, from George Washington to George Bush. George W. Bush, 283 years of history. President Biden is now on track to beat that. We're adding $1 trillion every 90 days to that debt. Within 5 years, 50 cents out of every dollar we spend in taxes is going to go to that debt. Within 10 years, 100%. So this is existential for our country. And that's one of the reasons we have to cut back the military budget. You can't cut your way out of the debt, but you got to begin by getting it so we de-accelerate it. And we need to invest money. Every dollar that we spend on weapons creates 2 jobs. Every dollar we spend on child care creates 22 jobs. Oh, we need to grow the economy so the debt proportionally gets smaller. The other big opportunity is chronic disease. That is now 4.3 trillion. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, 60% do. And it's costing 4.3 trillion, 5 times the military budget. Diabetes, when I was a kid, a typical pediatrician would see 1 case of diabetes in his lifetime, in his career, 40 or 50-year career. Today, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through his office door is pre-diabetic or diabetic. And, you know, nobody is asking about why this happens. Autism rates in my generation, 70-year-old men, is 1 in 10,000 today, right now. In my child's generation, it's 1 in every 34, according to CDC, 1 in every 22 boys. And we're spending, there's a recent article, peer-reviewed publication by Mark Blaxall et al. That says the current cost is about $1 trillion a year. And we know what's causing it. It has to be an environmental toxin. Genes don't cause epidemics. And, you know, we've got these epidemics of autoimmune disease, an entire generation. 60% of these kids, and that is a conservative estimate, now have autoimmune diseases, neurological diseases, obesity, peanut allergies, food allergies. All of this happened beginning around 1989. We know what the suspects are. You know, it's glyphosate, it's neonicotinoids, it's atrazine, PFOA, flame retardants, cell phone radiation, high fructose corn syrup. But NIH will not identify which exposures are contributing or causing this. Once you do that, once NIH does that, you can end them, because the lawyers now come in and, you know, like I did with Monsanto, everybody said we'll never get rid of glyphosate. But I represented, you know, we had 40,000 clients. We were suing one at a time. The first suit, we won $289 million. The second suit, we won $89 million. The third suit, we asked the jury for $1 billion, and they gave us $2.2 billion, and Monsanto came to the negotiating table and said, okay, we're done. And they agreed to pay $13 billion and take glyphosate out of home gardening products. We can do that with all these exposures, but NIH has to do its job. It has a $42 billion budget, distributes that money to 56,000 scientists who are supposed to do research to find out why we're the sickest country in the world. There's no nation in the world that has this chronic disease problem. We had, during COVID, we had the highest body count in the world from COVID. We're supposed to have the best medical system. We had 16% of the COVID deaths. We only have 4.2% of the global population. Why is that? The CDC says it's not our fault. It's because Americans are so sick. They said the average American who died from COVID had 3.8 chronic diseases. So they had diabetes, they had obesity, they had asthma, and one other thing. And we have the highest chronic disease burden on earth. Why is that? We spend more on our medical system than anybody. We spend 2 or 3 times with the Europeans, and we're 79th in outcomes. We're behind Cuba, Costa Rica, Mongolia, Nicaragua. Why is that? It's because we have crooked agencies who are working. Anyway, I'm going to fix that, and we can fix it very quickly. And we can use AI. You know, we've got AI is another huge existential issue. You know, Elon Musk said AI is going to first steal our jobs, and it's going to kill us. Between those two, it's going to turn us into slaves if we just let it go. But AI also has this extraordinary potential to make our lives better, to make us healthier, to identify all the waste in government. You know, the Pentagon hasn't passed an audit in 20 years. It lost this audit, this particular year. It says it lost $4 trillion in material. They don't know where it is. We get AI walkers to go through all of their inventory stockyards. We can identify exactly what's happening. And, you know, with AI, with blockchain, we have this tremendous, we can use AI to make the government responsive, or we can use AI to allow the government to enslave us. And, you know, we need a president who's thinking of this. We have to regulate AI, and blockchain we need to bring back. AI and blockchain are the industries we need to make this country the hub for those industries, because those are the industries that are going to get us out of this deficit debt spiral. Because we need and you can't over-regulate. You have to regulate AI, but you can't over-regulate it or you'll drive it offshore to China. We already drove blockchain offshore. Switzerland in the last 2 years has registered 1,200 new cryptocurrencies. The capitalization of those is $360 billion. We should be doing that here. We're driving these industries, these new, innovative, the most innovative people in the world, the greatest entrepreneurs. We're driving them to Switzerland and Singapore and China. We need to make this the ecosystem where they feel like Silicon Valley pulled us out of the last deficit debt spiral. But we need new industries to do that, and those are going to be blockchain. They're going to be AI. We have 2 guys who are running for president. I don't know, but I don't think they're thinking about this. So anyway, thank you all very, very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight for the 2024 Presidential Policy Perspective Series. Check out more great events at nixonlibrary.com, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you and good night.